Hi, Rae.
Hi.
Welcome to Where the Climate Things Are. How are you today?
Making it through day by day. These are wild, wild times we're living in. So, yes,
Yeah, I
I'm
know.
okay.
How are you is a loaded question beginning of February 2025 when headlines seem to be changing with wild news every day. So,
Indeed.
yeah. I was wondering if, firstly, you could introduce yourself to the audience. Tell us a little bit more about you and who you are.
Yes. Well, my name is Rae Oquirrh Dial, and about a year ago, I decided to shift and go by my middle name, which is its own story. But a lot of people, especially with my background in the outdoor industry, probably know me as Janie. And I have always been Janie Rae Dial. So it's really not that huge a pivot. But yeah, it's Rae Oquirrh Dial. And yeah.
Can you tell me a little bit more about the origin story of your middle name? I really find that interesting.
Oquirrh
Yeah.
or Rae.
True. Your new middle name, your new one.
Yeah, it's such a beautiful word. It's a very strange spelling, which is Oquirrh. And when I was first learning how to read, I moved into a new neighborhood that was named Ochre Shadows. And my little brain couldn't figure out how Oquirrh made any linguistic sense. So it always stuck in my mind as an anomalous word, but a beautiful construction of letters. And it's also a Goshoot word, which means shadow of the mountain. And I think that where this will be pertinent to our conversation is I'm not sure that I'll always live in Utah, and life is changing, and climate migration is on my mind. And I never once thought in my life that I'd say I'd become a climate migrant. But that is fast becoming a reality for so many people. And so as I was thinking about my name, not only did I want to adopt something that felt more true and real and appropriate for who I am now today, which is Rae, I also wanted to bring forth this name that I would carry with me wherever I go on the planet as kind of an homage to my childhood and to the mountain range where I was born and to my roots, so to speak. And then my amazing, beautiful, favorite human in the world, my dad. His name is Robert Dial, and he adopted me when I was about a year and a half old. And carrying his name forward is also really important to me. So each of my names has significance.
I love that. Thank you for sharing.
Mm-hmm.
And what a wonderful experience of, I'm sure changing a name is not just that. It's like there's an identity piece there. There's a shift of self, I'm sure. So thanks for sharing that. Mm-hmm. And in that vein of climate, you said sort of a realization around climate migration and having a climate presence or climate being a presence in your life. I was curious if, and I ask this of every guest that comes on, but I was curious if you could share if you had an aha moment on climate, on environment in your life that you can point to, if you remember that, or if you've had one recently. How did that show up for you in your life?
Well, I was really lucky in that I grew up with a very outdoorsy and outdoor-oriented family. And so I had a free-range childhood where I was able to be set free on two different properties, actually. A cattle ranch in Wyoming that is about 400 acres with two rivers running through it at the base of the Uintas, which I even saying that now, of course, at the time I had absolutely no clue how valuable, how that would send me on a journey and a path to working with and for the natural world, in a sense, and defining my relationship and my environmental identity at a really, really young age. And so I'm really thankful for my childhood in that way. But I would say that my awakening to the predicament that I think we're in as a society and as cultures and as humans on planet Earth at this moment in time right now Came with Wilder, which was my former startup. I started to pay just much closer attention to systems and cycles, I would say. And by learning about not just conservation efforts and how to bridge the for-profit and nonprofit sector, which is the approach that we took with building the first female-founded B Corp in Utah, rah, rah, rah. But thinking about systems, cycles, seasons, and also how products are made and how many hands and how many different ecosystems and how much it takes for a single product to reach your doorstep or to reach a shelf. And so, but I would say even before then, a book that really transformed my thinking was called Cradle to Cradle. And that was part of a sociology class that I took when I was, I think, 18 years old or something like that at community college. I was taking a philosophy course and then I took a sociology component. And for some reason, donut economics and the idea of regenerative cycles was part of that class. And so I'm going to date myself. That was probably 1999, which is a long time ago. So I would say I've been in relationship to and in a conversation of what are now buzzwords like regeneration and sustainability and climate. But I grew up with a really deep, deep sense that I was part of the world and part of the natural environment. And so I've always had a really intimate relationship with being outside and both from a recreational standpoint and from kind of a philosophical and spiritual standpoint as well.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing all that. I think it is wild to hear about a childhood, as I love how you put it, like a free range childhood, being in touch with nature, being around landscapes and how that shapes our relationship to these academic studies. And it's also very true that these words have become a bit they're buzzwords now, regenerative or circularity, cyclical. And yet it's rooted in a very real practice or idea of, the cradle to cradle kind of framework is very much a real way that shaped I remember hearing about that and being like, makes so much sense. How can we live like that? How can we live with this, it's not the take, make, waste linearity model. It's the, it's a circle. It's like life is a circle. And how can we also kind of treat the earth in a circular way where we're not taking from it, we're also giving back and we're regenerating. So I really appreciate you sharing all of that. And I am curious to learn a lot more about your relationship as an entrepreneur, your journey as an entrepreneur, because I feel like that is something that I know about you. When we first got in touch around climate work recently, I had known your work in the outdoor industry, in the outdoor space. And Wilder, as you mentioned, was one of those startups and pieces of business that you built. But take us through a little bit more of your journey as an entrepreneur, and you can take that however you want. But I'm curious, because I feel like that really gets us to, which I want to talk about a little later, like where you are now and what you're building in the climate space. But you are someone that is clearly so entrepreneurial. So take us through that a little bit. I'm curious to learn more.
Yeah. Well, I always identified as an artist. Creativity and how to tap into those places and spaces inside us that are imaginative and generative and curious. I always really fit into that profile of identity. I always knew that I would probably take the path less traveled, if you will. I grew up in a really conservative Mormon environment in Salt Lake City, Utah. And from the moment I plopped out of the womb, I think I was asking way too many questions. And I always knew that the religion and that identity was not a fit for me. I've written before that I felt like religion for me is like wearing a wet polyester suit. It's never going to feel comfortable for me. And when I started to learn more about Eastern philosophy and the idea of these different models of the world, where rather than a creator God that places, Adam and Eve into the planet, essentially, I think we would say that we were alien in that sense. Or some would say God's creation, however you interpret that. And then you lay that against a philosophy or a conceptual framework of being grown of the earth. And the latter always made more sense in my mind and also internally as well. And as I've navigated so many different paths in life, that's been such a compelling guide, because you love what you experience in the world, and the idea of world as mother, a more matriarchal structure, a way of feeling a sense of belonging in the world. Those concepts all made really good sense to me and still do. And so I would say I've always been kind of on I guess you could call it a spiritual journey. I was a pretty militant atheist for most of my life until I started doing a pretty regular and consistent meditation and yoga practice, which, come on, like, this is the script and subplot of so many movies and books like Eat, Pray, Love, and so many transformational
Doesn't
stories.
mean it's not real. Doesn't mean it's not a real way to go.
Totally. But it's true. I really hadn't looked at my own psycho-spiritual evolution until I was probably about 23, 24, when I was working on a film set. I actually worked on the film Coraline, which was a really fun stop motion project with a bunch of weird animators from all over the world. And
that sounds awesome.
It was. The director of that film practiced yoga. And so he would bring in teachers to our film set, which was in a warehouse in the middle of, big fields in Oregon, just outside of Portland, where I spent most of my adult life. And I remember one of those first yoga classes I took, I think I cried because I'd always also identified as an athlete, and I was kind of athletically inclined, and I was, had big dreams of being a pro snowboarder, which never realized. And it was the first time where I was using my body in a way that felt deeply uncomfortable. I wasn't good at it.
Yeah.
And it caused me to kind of turn a mirror on myself, because I started to notice that I had gone so long in this really, really bound up, almost militant position. And I had tried to arm myself with knowledge and techniques and tactics for fighting with more conservative ideologies. And that was the first time in my life where I really started to question those tactics. And I started to develop an awareness, I suppose, of loving kindness and more compassionate ways of viewing myself in the world. And so yeah, that's where things began. And I think when you start to become awake and aware to suffering, you start to really notice not just where you're suffering internally, but how that extends beyond the borders of your own body. And so coming to realize not just the suffering of my own experiences, but what animal agriculture, what the climate was suffering through. I kind of gradually became more and more aware of my place in the world, and how I might take the strategies I was learning for how to inspect and observe and adjust and adapt my behavior in more loving and compassionate, kind-hearted ways. And I think that also translated to the beginning seeds of activism and how to become activated from the place where I was standing. So, yeah.
Wow. I love that. I also have had just those experiences where you're like, I have held so much in my body. Like, I can feel how closed off I've been, or how hunched over I've been. And I sort of say that physically and also, you know, metaphorically as well. Like those moments where you, like we've talked about before together, like being broken open or being sort of opened up to something that maybe was hard. And there's maybe a tension there. And I mean, gosh, it's like the perfect embodiment of this is, at least for me, doing yoga for the first time after not doing yoga for a while, which is me right now. Haven't done yoga for a while. Got to do that. And then I feel like when I do, I'm always like, wow, this hurts. This is hard. And yet my body feels a certain way after. And I feel like it's like a really, not to be, you know, overly metaphorical with all of it, but I do think there's something there where, you know, when we're like, I'll reference kind of where we're at and with the news and the, like, I know we'll talk a lot about mental health and anxiety today. Like I feel my body react to those things and realize that I kind of manifest that in a tense, hunched way that like, and there's fear, like what fear does to my body and all these things. And I've been noticing that over the last few weeks. And I'm so glad to talk to you today because I feel like, you know, diving into that together is always very helpful for me. But that real physical manifestation of different feelings and like climate anxieties or anxieties in general, but specifically with the state of things, it feels more, feels right there for me right now. Like it feels very present and I notice it in my body. So I appreciate you sharing that. Cause I think even when you're like, I don't know, a certain age or maybe younger in life and you haven't done something before and then you realize like, oh, I'm not good at this. But also it's kind of like really helpful for my body. Like this is really amazing.
Well, it's also just the realization that you're not practiced at something. And if nobody ever shows you the way or shows you a tool set or gives you the imaginal capacity to think about a different framework or a different way of being and doing and orienting, then you might just kind of at a surface level keep doing what you've been taught. And there are just, systemic ways of never really becoming tenderized to what's happening outside of our own siloed little worlds. And I think your original question was, well, what does this have to do with entrepreneurship? And I would say it has everything to do with entrepreneurship, because in learning and becoming more tender to observing and to bearing witness to your own ability to shift and change and pause in your reactivity, that also comes in handy when you're doing something with a really, really high rate of risk. And so my relationship to becoming a little bit more awake, a little bit more aware, a little bit, I think, more tender in these ways was a precursor to some really pivotal events that happened in my life. One of them was when I was 30, I went to a doctor and she told me that my nutrient levels and vitamin levels were some of the lowest levels that she had seen. And as a 29-year-old, that was what I would call a wake up, shake up moment when I realized I have a thing called burnout. And again, that's yet another really well-known, ubiquitous word right now. But back then, this is in 2009, I thought there's got to be a different way of being where I'm not working 80 hours a week and I'm not the world's most iron deficient person at 29.
Jeez.
And so that was a big wake-up call for me. And as I'm kind of floating at a high altitude with you answering these questions now, you start to see these demarcation lines in the person you were before an incident or a milestone moment and the person you became after. And there are these, I call them like portal moments, or you could call it transformational moments. And sometimes it's a single experience and sometimes it's iterative and it's a process where you chip away at something and then have a big realization. I would say the first one was when I was 30, realizing that I was deeply unhealthy and that I was not on a track in a body that I related to, and I wasn't practicing the methodologies of my yoga and meditation practice to the extent that they made a big difference in my life. And so And then the other huge event, I'm going to skip ahead a little bit, was a really traumatic one, which is that, for most of my life, I had wanted to be a filmmaker. I related to being a creative and a storyteller. And I fell in love and I moved to Northern California. And I was doing something that not a lot of people had done up until that point, which was be a digital nomad. This was a pioneering, crazy thing that I was testing out.
No one's heard of it. It's new. Yeah, I love it.
Where I uprooted my life from Portland, Oregon, where I was very happy and healthy and thriving, but fell wildly in love. And to make a really long chapter quite short, it ended really tragically with the death of my partner. And so I can look back now, and I think that would be the second chapter of an experience where I had to confront yet again something on a much, much deeper existential level about the path that I was on and the actions that I was taking, and really, really reassess who I wanted to become in the aftermath of so much suffering and pain. And his name was Brad Parker, and we were climbing in Yosemite, and he went to go solo. I now know it was soloing. I didn't know at the time because it was my first time to Yosemite, but he went, we did a 5-pitch climb up Cathedral Peak, which is just this gorgeous classic. And if it's your first time in Yosemite, which it was for me, I was like a kid in a candy store. I had never seen such mesmerizing landscape, and it was extraordinary. I was in awe of not just the natural beauty, but that day was just a really intense day. I felt like I was alive in ways that I hadn't been in a long time. Sometimes you get into these silos where life becomes pretty mundane, and it's one day after the other and 1 week after the other, and we'd arrived in Yosemite, and I remember the walk up to that climb. I was bouncing. I felt like I was just kind of running and bouncing up the trail because I was so enlivened by it, and I was just in such awe of the grandeur of that landscape. And and it's obviously tragic. It's incomprehensible that a person so alive as Brad and so well versed in climbing. He had climbed all over the world. He was on the cover of Climbing magazine at one point. He was a 514 climber. One of his good friends was Kevin Jorgensen. And I think the summer before, he had gone up to the Dawn Wall to go look at Kev's project. And so he knew this area so well, and he was so well versed in the terrain. But as often occurs in the outdoor world, accidents happen and rocks break, and I'll never be able to know for certain what occurred, but what I do know is that he was down climbing a notch in Mathis Crest, and either he had a back spasm or his foot slipped or a rock broke, and it doesn't matter. I spent way too long trying to be a researcher of what occurred, and he died. And so that was a moment of, I would say, deep existential awakening, and it was violent. It was awful. It was brutal, and to be a 34-year-old confronting the reality of a future that just poof disappeared. So much of the time we spend our lives thinking about what's next and what's to come, and the family that we'll have, or the home that we'll build, or the kids, all the things. And grief really betrays all of that. But for all of the terror and horror that grief brings, it also offers lucidity in a way that I've never experienced before and may never experience again. And this is, again, that kind of portal where you can look at the person you were the day before something occurs And you can look at the person you are in the day after and in the months after and the year after and go, wow, I actually did change. I changed internally and I changed externally and I changed my whole world. And the way that my world changed in the aftermath of that is that from those lessons and from that confrontation with mortality, I wondered what I could do to be a storyteller, to be a creative, to bring all the lessons of my practices, my experiences into something that would be authentic and something that would serve a kind of greater good. And I know that sounds like virtue signaling. I wasn't setting out to change the world, but I was setting out to change a system. And the system that I hoped to leave a mark on was the outdoor industry. So
I feel very honored to have you share that story, because I know you've probably shared it many times before and talked probably to no end about it. And yet I'm sure it's never easy. So thank you, Rae, for that. And also, I think that helps. I appreciate this being with us in this conversation, because I think it helps to feed into where what you're building now, and the work with mental health and anxiety within climate, because and grief, because you are not someone that is unfamiliar with grief, meaning you have had a lot of it in your life. And I can tell when I meet people, and I'm not ever wishing anything upon anyone, but there's something in the book, The Prophet by Khalil Gibran, about like the deepening of the bowl that's carved within us. And there's sort of these like, I did not expect to talk about this in this forum, but here we are. I think about it all the time. Like there's I call it sort of the deep bowl, but it's more, I think he describes it as more of like a well or something that is carved within us. And if there's joy, that's wonderful. But like sorrow is actually the thing that sort of carves us deeper, if you will, and deepens that bowl, that well. And then when joy comes in eventually, because sorrow is very real, but it's kind of a carving mechanism. And then when that empties out, there's more room for joy, and there's more like deep capacity for emotion is where I'm going with this. And I think, you are someone that clearly has had your well carved. And I mean that in like all of the different ways of having to go through an unthinkable thing and happening and occurrence in your life at such a young age and with such a close person. And yet your bowl is so able to feel a lot of different kinds of emotions to such a great depth. And I think that when I meet people like you and others in the world who have had these happenings, I can tell right away. There's sort of like like this person has been through some life. Like this has happened where like, it's always wonderful to meet folks who are like very happy and bubbly and have like a very positive outlook on life. But I think there's a lot of surface level components to that too. And so I just appreciate knowing like you built this current project, you built Unthinkable, which I'd love to hear more about, out of the well, like out of the place in you that has felt the depths of unthinkable despair. Again, that word comes back in. It's actually like quite fitting. There you go. I can't even like fathom and put words to what you have experienced. And yet what a creation you've brought out of your grief, your understanding of depression, the depths, the mental health of despair. Like then you've brought to life this work that now exists in the world around climate, but that is built with so much, like empathy doesn't even cut it. Like I feel like empathy is not even getting at the word I want, but I'll go with that, because like what you are building comes from a place of, I have been through these depths. I have the deep well that I'm building from. And I think that is quite an incredible thing. So with all of that preamble, I was wondering if you wanted to talk a little bit more about Unthinkable and the work you're doing with, and the work in general around mental health and climate, because I think that that's something that we don't always talk about. Mm-hmm. I am someone that works in climate. There's a lot of folks I know that work in climate. There's policy, there's electrification, there's, energy grids, and there's seawall building for sea level rise adaptation. And yet there's also this grief. There's also this anxiety. There's also these mental health issues that we all, I'll say it, I think everyone carries it to some degree. Maybe, well, I don't know, maybe even someone who's a climate denier might have like that denial repressing it down. I don't know. Like there's emotion around the way we relate to the earth, especially right now. And I would just love to hear like how you came into this idea, how you came into this work, who you've built this with, how you've built this. And I'll stop with that because that's like 7 questions in one, but I'm so curious to hear more about your work in this space.
Yeah. Lessons compound over lifetimes. And
Certainly.
You never think that it'll be that way. And the person you were at 20 and the person you were at 30, and then now the person I am in my 40s and not all people, grief doesn't always transmute in ways that I would see as super positive for folks. I think there are many different pathways, and grief can be hyper destabilizing for people.
Absolutely.
And every journey and every experience of something traumatic is really different. And there are a spectrum of emotions and ways of relating that have to do with your pre-existing conditions, with your family structure, with your social capital, with your economic security or insecurity. And so I was very lucky that I really did kind of fall into the arms of my community during that time, where I suspected that the reasons that I loved religion and that I loved being part of a community of people growing up was because of that social capital and because of that sense of belonging and care that naturally comes, especially in the aftermath of disasters of any form. And so yeah, all those lessons of community resilience and who I became, not in spite of what occurred, but because of it, and the transformative power of grief and sorrow and all of these myriad emotions we experience to change us, to galvanize us, and to point us in really helpful directions. The feelings that occur for you, they matter, first of all, and they can oftentimes be really blessed road signs. And so the sign for creating Wilder, the first startup after Brad's death, was to try to build a bridge between the for-profit and the nonprofit sector, and to create a platform where ethical consumerism was normalized, where women, whether you're a conservationist, an outdoor person, or a mom, could have a voice and a space that was representative of the unique experience from a female perspective. And so Wilder was a really beautiful experiment in how to bridge those gaps and how to build really channels for advocacy in a for-profit business structure and with a triple bottom line model, which obviously Patagonia and Cotopaxi and so many other brands pioneered before we did, and who we took really specific cues from. But ultimately, we grew out of Wilder. I alongside my co-founder and all the beautiful souls that contributed to it, laid it to rest in early 2020, right as the pandemic was beginning. And in that year, I experienced yet another of those milestone moments, which is I confronted a really, really loosening sense of mental well-being. And by loosening sense, what I actually mean is I had a mental health collapse.
Yeah.
I had never been suicidal in my life. It had never occurred to me to want to orient myself towards thinking about what I could, how I could become non-existent, to put it really softly. And that experience humbled me to the bone. I realized, number one, that misery is not a choice, and that yes, you can recover from traumatic experiences, but mental health is a really, it's a sensitive subject, and it's a really tricky subject, and it's a very complex subject, because depending on your genetics, your family structure, your all the demographic profile, your unique positionality in the world, all of those things determine how things will occur for you internally. And I became really, really humbled by it, but just totally tenderized to the fact that I had the capacity to be in that headspace and to really, truly want to die. The empathy that I experienced when I finally got the help that I needed and got better in ways. And I'll never really, I think, be over it or be cured or be healed from this thing called depressive tendencies. That's not going to be my reality. But what I do know is that by understanding on such a visceral, hyper emotional level what it was like to be in that space where it felt like an alien force had come to remove my sanity and had come to remove all of the awe and joy and wonder from my life, I realized, wow, I've really taken for granted that I'm generally speaking, have high self-esteem and a mentally well person. So that was a transformative experience, and it obviously led directly into this new exploration of what climate impacts are doing to us. And so often when we talk about climate solutions or the climate crisis in general, even using the word solution is sort of strange to me, because unfortunately the reality is that we are on a path, and there are some things that are simply never coming back to the way that they were. There is no return to some ecosystems to what they looked like 50 years or 100 years ago. And I think we have to really accept and confront that reality. And so rather than call them solutions, I think it's probably more appropriate to call this a predicament. And predicaments don't always have answers, but predicaments do ask us to become adaptive. And adaptation is really interesting as a subject matter because, again, our creative capacities have to be harnessed and yoked and strengthened. And I find that to be a really enlivening experience. And so in some ways, the confrontation with how to adapt, who to adapt with and alongside, and how my vocation and the work that I do on a daily basis will contribute to my own adaptation capacity and the capacity of my localized community, and perhaps even a ripple effect to maybe not make massive change from a solutions-oriented perspective, but how we might build stronger ties and root down into a greater sense of resilience and build the muscle that we are actually going to need, and that our kids are going to need, and that every generation after is going to need to survive and thrive. So the word unthinkable keeps coming up. I love the word because it connotes the unimaginable. It connotes thinking. And again, oftentimes people are so hyper-focused on solutions and the scientific methodologies and the bureaucratic methodologies or the policy methodologies to transform our systems. And we need all of that. And so, yes, let's bring all of that to the table. But we've had the best thinking devoted to solving this crisis for over 5 decades. And our natural disasters are becoming more and more exacerbated. Our CO2 levels are still going up, and more people are becoming climate migrants, to kind of bring this conversation full circle. So I think that there are behavioral, there are psychological, there are these imaginative and regenerative possibilities that exist for how to move more hearts and minds and bodies towards different ways of being and doing. And so the name Unthinkable, in essence, is an invitation towards moving beyond the intellectual even and the scientific and into the somatic, into the lived, and into the imaginal and liminal spaces of moving people towards different objectives and moving and aggregating people towards this cause of really taking more and more care to observe the internal landscape and the internal climate emotions that I think a lot of us are feeling, be it anxiety or straight up doom, and sit with those feelings and metabolize them. And then when you do that with other people, as psychology often shows us, and there's lots of research to prove this point, we find that resilience is rooted in relationship, that protective social infrastructure or community capital are the ways by which people are transformed through chaos and trauma and oligarchy and climate deniers and the political forces that we stand against in this moment. So that's what Unthinkable means.
I love that. And how does Unthinkable tell us more about what the platform is? Or maybe it's not a platform. Like, how does it show up? Where is it in the world? And also, how did it come to be? Because I think you have a really great collaborator that I also wanted to mention too, that you came across. So tell us the story of how y'all started it.
Yeah, in 2021, I think, maybe it was 2020, I found a Substack newsletter called Gen Dread, which is also the name of a book called Generation Dread, written by an author and researcher named Dr. Britt Rae. Britt is extraordinary, and I feel so lucky to have now built a platform which we just launched into the world at Unthinkable.Earth, which is a platform for helping people to process, name, and metabolize climate grief. And there are many different names for climate related distress. There's like eco-anxiety and ecological grief. There's climate distress. There's solastalgia. There are all sorts of names and conventions for understanding, but I think boiled down, we can simply say our climate emotions and how we relate to watching in real time our living systems being decimated for profit. Boiled down, That's what we're dealing with. So the platform that we've built is a place where you can find resources for your own coping, resilience building, community building, and change making. And so that means we serve youth grappling with eco-anxiety, parents navigating hard conversations, educators fostering discussions with young people, especially educators who work in sustainability or environmental sectors, who, when presenting data sets that are pretty extraordinarily dark, know how to be there with their students and be there at a psychological and an emotionally intelligent level to deal with the facts in these models. And because there will just never be enough care providers or therapists or counselors to support all of the people that need help, we really do try to, what we've built as a resource hub, to meet people exactly where they are so that they can help themselves. And of course, yes, we want people to have individualized care for whatever it is that they're feeling, but it's also a place where you can really identify groups and organizations working at this intersection of climate and mental health and climate psychology. And I think most importantly, when you arrive at the website, it's pretty validating if you do experience even the slightest bit of anxiety. So if you're a parent who's like, man, my kid is inheriting a really messed up system, I'm feeling nervous about that, you're going to find resources. If you're a professor at a college who's doing geospatial sciences or geological sciences or atmospheric sciences, and you look at CO2 arcing into, scary zones, you're going to find resources and research and materials that can help you, normalize that it's totally, to really remove the pathology, that feeling, dread, despair, and hopelessness is anything but completely normal, and it is completely normal. And it's not a pathology to feel distress at witnessing what we are and the level of destruction and contamination and biodiversity loss that we're all witnessing. And so really, I think validation is kind of the first step to galvanizing people towards more pro-environmental behaviors and more pro-social behaviors. And this is what we call internal activism.
I love that. I'm smiling with my face and my body as you say all this, because I feel like I've been kind of under this cloud for the last few weeks of whatever emotions I've been feeling. I know you just I have two more questions for you, and then I will let you go, but I'm very excited to talk to you more about your experience recently at Sundance. So I know you just spoke at Sundance on a panel or forum that I think was hosted by the Hollywood Climate Summit, but we both shared with each other that we're both big fans of the work they do. I'll absolutely link to their work as well in the show notes for the show. But I know one of the topics that came up was about community care and collective care, and you're speaking to that now, and you've also used the word resilience. So what ways does community care play a role in us forming our own levels of resilience, both short term, kind of in the day to day, I'm reading the headlines, I'm feeling distressed, I'm feeling anxious, and kind of in that long term horizon? And I'm not suggesting that you have all the answers, but I'm curious your thoughts on that topic, because it's a big one. It's a big one. But I'm grappling with it every day. And I feel like that's something that you've spoken to before, and curious for your thoughts.
For a lot of people in the global north, myself included, this growing climate anxiety, I think, has a lot to do with the fact that most of us who occupy more privileged spaces have never known the world to be unsafe. And so I think it's really important to point out that resilience building strategies, I think, are best adopted from the various wisdom traditions that we find in not just indigenous communities, but I even find them in my Buddhist practice, which says that whatever happens to me also happens to you, and therefore justice means working for you and your babies and not just my babies and my community. And so I think taking a lot of cues from indigenous wisdom is a key part of really understanding how to build long-term community resilience. So I think that's probably the most important point there, and was a really crucial and potent topic that we discussed. But I think at its core, collective care acknowledges that no one can bear the weight of this alone. It shifts the focus from individual resilience into a more expansive relational form of resilience, which is rooted in interconnectedness. And this is the not so secret sauce that sustains movements for justice and transformation. You can find this in a lot of literature around the civil rights movement. Dr. Martin Luther King had a really beautiful speech that he gave, which I would recommend everybody go watch if you're feeling that despair, where he states that he's proudly maladjusted. And what he means by that is he's never going to conform to the rules and the ways of being and doing in a sick society. Mm-hmm. And so if you're feeling this disruption internally, that's normal. You're maladjusted to a very, very sick and pathological administration that thrives on oppressive tactics. So, and then I'm not a totally full-on Buddhist. I would say I'm a dabbler. And but even from a Buddhist perspective, collective care is really an essential expression of interdependence, which is this fundamental truth that all beings and experiences are interconnected. And when I meditate on this, it's just a constant reminder that our suffering is not separate. It's part of a shared human and more than human condition. Mm-hmm. And by tending to it together, we can dissolve this illusion of isolation. And even emotionally, I think we all know, even though it doesn't always feel that way, something that I experienced when I was in the throes of despair was, man, I'm the only one, I'm the only one to be in this chasm of utter horror. But the fact is, every other human that has ever lived and every human alive right now will bear witness to the loss of something precious. Yeah. So I think it's like, yeah, you can meditate on it, but the practice is really building community around it and feeling your feelings and talking about it. So, yeah.
Yeah, that's very real. Yeah, the word that I've heard around climate specifically and feeling alone and isolated is pluralistic ignorance. People feel like not enough, like no one else cares about the climate and no one else cares about these emotions because we don't talk about it. And they do. It's really common. A lot of people actually do, which is why I'm also doing this project, is because I'm like, I'm going to record talking about these conversations with people in hopes that it sparks, which it already has. I feel very grateful and lucky for the reaction to this, is that people are like, same. Like that episode you just published, same. That thing you guys talked about on there, feel it too. Like it's been a real, in this world we live in, at least for me, my community is spread all over the world and not just the country. And like folks who have, it's been nice to bring that together because I think there's a lot of people feeling those feelings, but like alone, in our own corners. And I think that's really hard because also, let's be real, like climate is not the most dinner party, it's like if I feel like this, where if I start talking about it, I'm kind of like, oh, there she goes, the downer or whatever, just spewing climate facts. And I'm like, I don't want to be that, but I also don't want to be alone. And I don't want people to feel alone. I want to like make people feel like I'm down to talk about it anytime. You tell me, kind of thing. And so, yeah, I think that's really important. And another really quick thing I was going to say was for the Trail Ahead, my other podcast project, Faith Briggs, my co-host, and I brought on I guess you call her a scientist, but also she's sort of a thinker around climate. And I believe her name was Sarah, and I'm forgetting her last name, and I will definitely link to this too. But she shares about how eco-anxiety, there's a privilege in eco-anxiety. This came out like 3 or 4 years ago, and it was fascinating to us, and we wanted to dig in there, and there definitely were racial connotations too, which is why we were talking about it on our podcast around representation in the outdoor industry, but in the outdoor community. But it was really interesting to hear kind of like, is it more, what are the privilege and access levels of like even having emotions around, or having arguably like the time and space and energy in life to have and feel these emotions, when there's also a lot of people that like maybe feel that they can't even think about the environment or have time to feel these things about the environment because like there's other stresses and anxieties in their lives. And so I think like what you brought in about Indigenous wisdom and communities that are forming around like and talking to Indigenous communities around land stewardship and traditional ecological knowledge, there's this sort of sense of like, yeah, we've always been doing this. Like we've been doing this since time immemorial. We've always been like connected to the land. What are you talking about? Like why? And I've experienced this too, where I'm like, tell me more, like in an interview, tell me more about like this specific academic climate topic. And they're like, oh, you mean just our traditional practices? Okay. Yeah. Like happy to talk about those. So I find it's all so interesting and it's all intertwined. And I'm glad to link to all these resources that we just talked about, because I think it's a fascinating deep dive conversation to enter into. But it's funny that you said solutions, the word solutions, because like how it kind of, maybe it's actually a predicament. But I do end this podcast by asking folks about their favorite climate solution that's not their own. So in this case, might not be unthinkable necessarily, but maybe a resource out there. And we don't have to frame it as a solution. We can say what's going on in this space that you look to as sort of an analogous space or analogous set of pathways and frameworks, clearly trying not to use the word solution, that you're impressed by or that you're excited about in the climate world.
Well, two things. Number one, I would say my colleague, Dr. Britt Rae's archive of writing on our Substack. So it's formerly known as Gen Dread. So if you look up Gen Dread, we're going to switch over to Unthinkable. But if you can find us on Substack under the name Unthinkable now. But I think at last count, there's almost 150 issues over the last half decade that she has amassed that really, really cover the zeitgeist of climate anxiety. And that's everything from climate colonialism to climate apartheid to these intersectional topics that will help, no matter where you are, your positionality, either global north perspective, global south perspective. So many different perspectives are represented there. And it's a treasure trove of incredible storytelling, essays, and interviews. And so I would say go to the Unthinkable Substack because it's extraordinary.
Great.
Shameless plug, but it's not. Yeah. It's her writing, and it's incredible. And it's what transformed my relationship to my own internal feelings of grief and sorrow as they relate to environmental destruction and my place in this movement. And then the word movement, there's a TED Talk, and we're going to have to put this in the show notes or something because I just forgot.
Definitely. I'll link to all these. Yeah.
I watched it recently, and it really, really touched my heart and broke me open in the best possible ways. It's a way to think about movement building. So I think from a narrative perspective, and because I'm a storyteller and I love creative strategy and I wanted to be a filmmaker when I grow up, there's a really pervasive narrative that says that there's a hero that comes and solves problems. And you'll find that all over in all modern media. And I'm really interested in a movement narrative as the alternative to that, or in addition to. And the movement narrative says that if you want to address a large scale problem effectively, what you need is a lot of people to move in the same direction and do a little bit each. And this is how all movements gain ground, gain substance, gain adherence, and gain momentum. And he goes on to tell the story of how Rosa Parks was an activist before she sat down on the bus that day and refused to give up her seat. And then after she received all of this recognition for what she had done by having the courage to stay seated and not allow for a white man to take her place, the story goes that she then went right back into the boring, mundane committees that she sat on, and phone banking and movement building, which is obviously the most unsexy work there is, but that's how we do this. And so I'd say that localized efforts are incredibly important, and forming committees, forming your local policy watch groups, getting involved at a really granular level wherever you are, because obviously it can cause tremendous overwhelm to think and imagine that you can save the world or solve this issue alone. It's the fossil fuel industries alongside really manipulative marketing tactics that developed this idea of a carbon footprint to place blame on individuals as if individuals can change the extraordinarily nefarious and extractive toll that fossil fuels play in the crisis that we're in. So really, there is just so much fun, enlivening, beautiful, generative work that's interesting and creative to be done exactly where you are. So if you're a teacher, bring sustainability initiatives to your school. Or if you're, an 18-year-old and you're not ready to go stand on the front lines with other activists, there's the more simple, mundane tasks of going into schools and working in a garden with kids. There's just so many places to start, and you'll find all of that. But this idea of building movements and telling better stories around movement narratives is something that I'm I'm becoming more awake to, and I'm noticing more and more. And I'd love to see more of in movies and scripts and podcasts. And there's a five, I think it's 5 steps he says, and I'm actually gonna just read this because they're so good.
Yeah.
Number 1, figure out what you're going to work on. You can't work on everything. So what's tugging on your heart right now? Number 2, find your people. Where there are other people who care about the thing that you do, go find them, join them, offer to help. Most movement people are going to be really happy to see you at the door. If you can't find them, get new friends together for coffee to talk about it, see if there's some work to do. Number 3, do an asset inventory. Think about what you have to work with, what skills, what knowledge, what social connections. Make a virtual pile on that table. And then think about step 4, which is to make an achievable short-term goal. If the goal can't happen in the next few weeks, it's too big. Break it down and start again. Number 5 is do that thing. Give yourself a deadline and make it happen. Number 6 is repeat, iterate, and if you need, repeat again. So
wow.
Yeah.
That's so great. It really resonates. This project, I had to set a deadline for myself. I was sitting on it for too long. I had to launch it. It was going to be imperfect. It was going to be a build as we go situation. And it's been a huge learning journey, but I love the set a deadline. And if you can't do it in the next couple of weeks, the goal is too large, like that kind of thing. That's great. Yeah. We will link to that too. So many good resources.
I will. Yeah.
That's so, yeah. And also just I think I reference Dr. Johnson, Ayanna Elizabeth Johnson, every episode probably, but the whole idea of what's your asset bank, or however you just framed it? What do you bring? What skills do you have? And then also what do you enjoy doing and what sustains, because that's going to be what sustains you. Those are all these different frameworks fit really nicely together. So I like that.
Yeah.
Rae, thank you. This was such a joy. Speaking of joy, in a dark time, admittedly a time where I feel I am, I'm not going to sugarcoat it. I'm overwhelmed by what's happening in our world. And I truly, truly enjoyed sitting with you, sharing this space, sharing this conversation, learning more about your journey into the work you're doing now. And also, I'm so excited to see where Unthinkable goes, where your movement building goes.
Yeah.
And we're going to link to all these resources because I feel like it was a treasure trove of resources itself, this podcast. So thank you. Thank you for everything.
You're so welcome.